first of all, Dr. Smith, I think most no one is in the waiting room anymore, so I think we can start. So everyone, please help me welcome Dr. Smith.
Good to see everybody. I'm going to put something in the chat window right now, which I've just, you should all see it, I think. Did it come up? Yeah, 2 links. So the first is an updated link to the handout. The handout that was sent around through various email chains needed a little bit more finessing. So if you're looking at a handout in front of you right now, please click the first link that will take you to the handout that I'm going to use right now. And the second one is just a copy of the actual paper. I've written this paper up. If you want to read it, it's there for your interest. But yeah, those are 2 documents that will be relevant to you. But the first one is very important because that's the thing I'm going to actually work off of through my talk today. So let's just get into it. I haven't given a philosophy talk in about, I think February 2020 was the last time. I've just been itching to do it. So I'm very happy that you all showed up to do some philosophy with me on a Friday afternoon. So thank you for that. So the thesis that I'm working with right now is has 2 parts. The first part is a claim about the nature of our attention. And the claim is that our attention to the world and to ourselves is massively biased by affects. And because of that, we are actually normatively accessible or evaluable in light of that bias. And so what I'm trying to do in this paper is to explore a little bit what it means for attention to be normatively evaluable, what that would mean. And the reason that's, I think, a philosophically interesting piece of philosophy to explore is that when we think about normative assessment, when we think about the way we do ethics, for example, or when we do epistemology and we evaluate people according to their rationality, normally what we tend to do is evaluate beliefs, actions, and intentions. Those are sort of canonical states of affairs that we tend to be comfortable normatively evaluating. So for example, if someone sincerely believes that the earth is flat, on the basis of that belief, we would judge them to be failing to meet a rational norm of maintaining a credence level of a belief that is proportional to their evidence. If someone's in the habit of punching babies, then on the basis of that behavior, we probably judge them to be a moral failure. That's not really good action. So a belief, an example of a belief, an action. And then finally, someone who does perform morally praiseworthy actions, who does it for the sake of receiving praise, that we might say that such a person has the wrong kind of intention, and that they are either morally compromised or at least deserving of less praise than if their intentions had been more forthright and noble. So I take these examples to be straightforward and paradigmatic cases where we commonly hold ourselves and others accountable to norms, and we do this by evaluating actions, beliefs, and intentions. So the question here is, but is attention, our ability to pay attention to the world and to ourselves, is that something that might be normatively accessible? Here's a preliminary argument to that effect. And one way to sort of get a grip on the argumentative motivations here is to just recognize the psychological role that attention plays in these other scenarios. So for example, so here's the argument. Actions, beliefs, and intentions are normatively evaluable in various ways. First premise. Second premise, if actions, beliefs, and intentions are normatively accessible in various ways, then it is not unreasonable to conclude that the core psychological functions which enable them are also normatively accessible in various ways. Third premise, attention is a core psychological function which enables the fixing of beliefs, actions, and intentions. For example, in order to form a belief, one ought to advert to their evidence. And what shows up for us as epistemic subjects as evidence is partially a function of what we're prone to pay attention to and ignore. So attention is there as a kind of gatekeeper for what ends up counting as evidence for us, and therefore plays a core psychological role in fixing evidence for belief formation. in order to perform the kinds of actions that tend to come in for robust normative assessment, one must be either paying close attention to what they're doing or not paying attention in some relevant way. And one might think that in a number of these scenarios, it is precisely those psychological facts about whether or not one is paying attention that help to establish whether or not one's actions are morally praiseworthy or blameworthy. Finally, our capacity to form intentions is grounded in our capacity to attend to the world selectively and to form goals on the basis of that selectivity, which in turn informs our intentions to act. So if that's right, then the conclusion follows, therefore, it is not unreasonable to think that attention is normatively accessible in various ways. So that's the argumentative motivation for what I'm going to be up to in my talk today. Now, before I get into the nuts and bolts of what I've been thinking about here, I want to just get some definitions on the table so that we're all using these words in the same way. First and foremost, attention, what is that? It should not surprise any of you to find out that philosophers of mind who are concerned about the nature of attention can't agree. And there's lots of debates about where we should locate attention and what the right kind of description should be for it. Should it be a neuropsychological kind? Is it a phenomenological kind? Where should we locate attention? I'm not going to get into arguments about this. I'm just going to kind of tell you where I stand on this and hope that it seems reasonable enough for you, and then we can move on. I'm happy to deal with objections about this if people think that there's a problem or that I've assumed too much. But in general, my view about what attention is and how we should theorize about it as a natural kind is very reliant on William James, Edmund Husserl, and more recently, Sebastian Wetzel. These thinkers agree that attention is a subject level phenomenon, right? So it's not some subpersonal, psychological, neurocomputational event. It is a robust phenomenological kind. It can be described as something, as a selection function. It is a psychological act whereby some content is prioritized over and above content that is deprioritized or deselected. And that which is attended to is emphasized phenomenally. That is, it's experiential over that which is unattended. So this creates a kind of gestalt structure, foreground, background, that is present in the structure of our experience in virtue of how we're attending to things. There's more to say, but I take that to be a rough and ready view that is agnostic about psychofunctional realization. That is, questions about where in the physical and functional architecture of the brain and the body attention is realized. I'm not interested in that question right now. Leaving it to one side. And I'm also going to ignore views like those of Wayne Wu, who think that there's no proprietary phenomenology of attention. He has some arguments to this effect. I think he's wrong, and I'm just going to sort of ignore those and just assume there's something it's like to pay attention and that it structures our experience into foreground and background. That's what I mean by attention. A few more terms that will be relevant here. Affective salience. Affective salience is the tendency of an object to stand out relative to its surroundings due to an association in the subject between the object's significance and the affective and emotional arousal the object solicits. Affectively biased attention is an attentional bias whereby preferential perception of a stimulus is instantiated based on the stimulus's affective salience. So for me, I think almost all of our attention is at least implicitly affectively biased in various ways. And so the reason why I want to focus on affectively biased attention as a phenomenon is because of how thoroughgoingly biased we are by our affective experience. And the way I want to convince you of that, there are different ways to argue for this. I have this really long sort of technical neuroscience paper just sort of going through all the effective neuroscientific data on this, and it's really boring. So what I want to do instead to argue for this part of the view is to just walk you through what I'll call, following Ronald D'Souza, 4 paradigmatic scenarios that just, I think, palpably and concretely demonstrate just how absurdly affectively biased we are. Okay, so the first one is severe pain. Now, the relevant example here that I always like to use is that first experience you've all had of when your hand is exposed to heat for the first time, that extreme pain, whether it's a campfire or a stove element, we've all had that experience. And we only needed to have it once. If you cast your mind back in your own personal biography, back to that moment, you will recall that you did not thereby extend your other hand like a good empirical scientist to make sure that you figured it out, that the stimulus really was presenting itself to you in the way that it seemed. No, that one experience of scalding pain on your extremity was enough to condition all of your subsequent behavior. From that moment forward, you were constantly avoiding stimulus that looked similar to that. You were on guard for it. So this is an example of how a single punctate moment of affective experience has conditioned the totality of all of your behavior, cognition, and attention subsequent to that exposure. Let's take a less dramatic example on the same side of the valence scale, slight discomfort. Human beings are terrible at dealing with slight discomforts. In the course of the next 40 to 50 minutes, you will experience several slight discomforts, and you will do something about them almost immediately. So for example, right now I can see that almost all of you are sitting in a chair, and perhaps the distribution of your weight on the chair is not exactly symmetrical. And so after some time, the part of your posterior that is receiving more of the weight of your body than the other is going to start to feel a little numb, slightly discomfort, not full-blown pain probably, but slight discomfort. And you know what you're going to do? You're going to shift your body. And maybe you'll start feeling slightly thirsty. So you know what you're going to do? You're going to drink. And maybe an itch will come up to which you will scratch. We are getting this kind of feedback from our bodies almost constantly. And we're really bad at just watching it happen, right? What we do is like, oh, I feel slightly uncomfortable. I will immediately deal with this. This is an example of how on a near constant basis, your mind is in a sort of reactive posture towards anything that shows up in the threshold of your embodied experience as being out of whack, even by a little bit, slightly left of center. Get back to the middle. Another example, slightly less dramatic, of how thoroughgoing affective feedback coming from the body conditions our behavior, biasing our attention, biasing the way we look at the world, shaping our sense of what's relevant and what's out there and what's in here. Let's go over to the other side of the spectrum and think about pleasure for a minute. So, moderate pleasures, moderate comforts. We need them. Think about the little kicks you get when your social media posts get a relevant threshold of likes, or the different sensory primes that you get when you enter into a restaurant or a kitchen, the mild satisfactions that obtain when you eat something delicious, the relief. Join the meeting. The relief you feel when you go to the bathroom. All of these things are happening all the time. Structuring your pre-reflective flow of consciousness and the attention which is structuring it. Okay? Finally, intense pleasure. The paradigm scenario here is sexual pleasure. Now, this is a little, I'm going to try and keep it PC here, but let's just be honest with ourselves for a moment. Most people, not all, but most people, when they first experience a sexual climax, have the following thought. How can I repeat this experience as reliably as possible, as often as possible from now until I'm dead? And we behave this way. Not all the time, but often, right? It's a paradigm for us. Okay? So the point here with these four paradigm scenarios is to recognize, both in very dramatic moments, but also in these sort of average, everyday fluctuations of the microdynamics of our experience, the pervasive affective primes that are structuring our attention, structuring our behavior, pushing us around. Now, it should come as no surprise that I anticipate these ideas. I find these sorts of ideas anticipated very deeply in some core theories of Buddhist moral psychology. And so what I would like to do very briefly before starting to talk to you about attention norms as I understand them is just to locate this idea I've tried to argue for in some Buddhist moral psychology, so that when I turn directly to my discussion of Buddhist philosophy in a few minutes, it will be anticipated by some basic foundations. There are two links, two joints in the Buddhist metaphysics of conditioned reality, which they call dependent origination, that are reflections of this basic idea. The first joint is the view that they call contact is the condition for the arising of feelings. Phassa paccaya vedana, which means that your body is alive and sensitive. And in virtue of being alive and sensitive, it feels things. And you're being constantly bombarded. And because of that bombardment, there are feelings happening all the time. You're just not paying attention to them all much of the time because you've got things to do. But they're there, driving your behavior in various ways, which leads us to the second joint, Vedana paccaya tanha, that Vedana, feelings, are the condition for the arising of craving, tanha, thirst, which for the Buddhists is a problem. It constitutes the cause of all suffering. Thirst or craving is the second noble truth, which is the cause or origin of all misery and unsatisfactoriness in life. And it's an attitude. And the attitude is very simple. I don't like pain. I really like pleasure. And I don't care about the neutral stuff. Right now, I'm having a bunch of neutral sensations in my feet. I'm not paying attention to them because it doesn't matter. My feet are working fine. I'm trying to keep this train of cognitive consciousness going so I stay coherent for an audience. I'm not paying attention to that. But when I look at the faces and I see someone's eyes go up and nod a little bit, I'm like, okay, that person's on board with me. Great. I feel a little kick and that motivates me to keep going. Or if I see someone who's just looking totally bored and disenfranchised, I'm like, oh, well, maybe they don't like it. And I go, stop, you have to keep going, right? This is constantly happening. This is the phenomena that I'm trying to sort of get into and then think about how does this constant perturbation affect our lives? It affects it massively. And then the normative question that arises out of that is, what should we do about it? What should we do about it? And the Buddhist answer is going to be, we should train our attention. Because our attention is something we actually have some agency over if we develop that. Which means that for these philosophers and for me, attention is something that is robustly, normatively evaluable. So that's what I want to do now, is talk to you a little bit about how attention might be normatively evaluable. And the first thing we have to keep in mind, and I'm at the top of page 3 of your handout if you're following along now, is that there are different types of norms, right? I've been vague about this up till now for this reason. There are different kinds of norms that we use to evaluate each other. So for the purposes of this talk, I identify 4. There are prudential norms, rational norms, moral norms, and what I'm going to call existential norms. One of my colleagues thinks I should call them eudaimonistic norms. They holistic norms about how your life is going on the whole. So a prudential norm is one where you can be more or less prudent depending on how and to what you attend. So prudence is kind of like, well, let's think of an example. If you're not paying attention to the flow of traffic when crossing the street, you risk harm or even death. So you're not being very prudent. You're not being very practical in that moment, okay? And you might think that the reason you're not being prudent is because you're not paying attention. This is why when people, this is why when I'm biking down the road and someone opens their door suddenly without looking out their mirror, I normally shout, well, I normally swear at them and then shout, pay attention. It's because you are failing to be a practical member of the world right now, and you almost cost me my life. So there's an example of prudence as a norm guiding attention. Okay? Now, we can distinguish prudence from rational norms. One can be more or less rational depending on how and to what they attend. So, for example, it is irrational to only attend to pieces of evidence that support your antecedently held beliefs. And we're all really good at this, right? We're all like, wow, look at all this evidence in favor of the beliefs I already hold. And we tend to be less attentive to those pieces of evidence that don't conform to our beliefs. And in fact, this is what they call confirmation bias. When we're presented with evidence that contradicts strongly held beliefs, we often hold on to those beliefs even stronger. That's a psychological phenomenon that psychologists are interested in. Important way in which we tend to fail or succeed to be rational, you might think precisely because of how we're paying attention to evidence or not. Morally speaking, one can be more or less moral depending on how and to what they attend. So for example, if you and I are having a conversation and I attend to one part of your body rather than another, that can be morally wrong. People deal with this all the time. It's really uncomfortable. It looks like what's going wrong there is someone's not paying attention in the right way and that they're morally culpable because of it. Finally, what I'm going to call existential norms. I'm going to claim that one's life as a whole can be said to go better or worse depending on how and to what one attends. So I'm going to give you a case study about this in just a minute, but in brief, the optimist and the pessimist might live very similar lives. We might specify the content of their lives to be very similar, even though the content of their experience, even though their sense of the value and meaning of their lives would be very different. So here's a case study. This is a true story. A friend of mine named Zach, who's also a philosopher. He and I have an unlikely friendship because he's really just absurdly optimistic all the time. And for those of you that know me, I can be a bit of a downer. I think I have good nature, but I'm a bit of a pessimist. I expect the worst. I've studied Buddhist philosophy for too long. I see suffering everywhere. And so what I want to try and walk you through is this idea that sort of orientation has a massive effect on the flow of one's life, and that orientation is attentional. So let's go through these norms one by one with some examples. Prudence. The optimist that I'm thinking of here, my friend and colleague, Zach, this is a person with a very wide attentional aperture. He is often just overwhelmed with how neat and great life is. He's like a dog with his head out the window going fast down the highway. He's a marvelous human being, like really, really brilliant, wonderful person, and he just loves life, really in love with being alive and with experience in general. And so much so that he once got lost driving home from my house to his parents' house, who lived 5 minutes away. Literally 5 minutes away, got lost driving the car at night. Because it's like, it's such a beautiful night. That's imprudent, right? On the other side, I can tell you from personal experience that if you're so focused on the worst case scenario and making peace with that, you miss a lot of the small things in life worth enjoying. There's a lot of missed opportunities in that. So there's a way in which this overall approach, which I've loosely called optimism and pessimism, can have an effect on your prudence and the way you are prudentially accessible for your attention. The same is true of rationality. My friend Zach and I are both guilty of the same sin. we are often prone to making very large, broad stroke claims about life itself. So Zach really says, life is great. To which I respond, no, Zach, your life is great. You have a great life. You know who doesn't have a great life? Lots of people. But I'm guilty of the same sin. Life is suffering. Life is hard. Maybe my life's hard. Maybe it's not as hard as I think it is, but maybe there are no facts of the matter about life itself when it comes to normative claims like this. And saying so is a bit irrational because you're always going to be ignoring huge swaths of evidence. So this general orientation has an impact on one's rationality. So also on morality. Sometimes you can over-attend to suffering in a way that makes us morally culpable. You have no idea how many family Christmas dinners I have ruined with existential observations. You don't want to know. It's happened. And sometimes when you're so drunk on how great life is, you don't see the suffering around you. And you're morally culpable for that, plausibly. Ignoring the suffering of others seems like a prima facie moral problem. So this is just an example of how this general existential attentional orientation can have an impact on one's moral standing by how they're paying attention to their environment, right? And so existentially, how we pay attention has an impact on the world we create for ourselves. We tend to find what we're looking for, yeah? The presuppositions that fundamentally structure our salience map thereby put those kinds of things that conform to it front and center in our pre-reflective attention. And we spontaneously discover those things in the world that conform to our biases. No kidding. So this is a way in which our attentional habits structure our world for us, make us normatively accessible, okay? One more thing before I start talking about some of the nuts and bolts of Buddhist philosophical psychology. Attention here has some different moving parts that I want to make you aware of. When you are attending to something, there are different components of that psychological act that might come in for evaluation along these various norms that I've just outlined. So for example, attention, when we pay attention to something, it has an intentional component. That is, we attend to things. So what you attend to might be normatively accessible. You're not paying attention to the right things. Attention also has an adverbial component, by which I mean a how. Attention is an activity, and how we attend might be normatively accessible. I can attend in an agitated way, or I can attend in a detached, calm, and stable way. And you might think that in various situations, context would demand certain qualities of attention from us. So if I'm in office hours with a student who's breaking down into tears over the death of their grandmother and asking me for an extension, and I'm just calm and detached, I might seem like a real jerk. And the reason I'm a jerk in that moment is because of how I'm attending to that student. For the record, I don't do that, but just an example. Finally, kind. There are different kinds of attention. In cognitive science, we tend to differentiate between what's sometimes called spontaneous or exogenous attention, the kind of attention that is driven by stimulus, the kind of attention that happens when there's a loud sound and you turn your head. By contrast, there's what's sometimes called directed or endogenous attention, which is the kind of attention that philosophers like William James are really concerned about, the willful, concentrated application of attention, sort of top-down, guided attention, where what's putting attention on its object isn't the object stimulating the subject, but is instead the intention or the guided goal.
Join the meeting.
Subject. Okay. You might think that there are times where you should be focused, your attention should be top down. When giving a lecture, for example, you might also think there are times where it's appropriate to just let your mind wander a little bit and just let the world guide you around. So if you're on a first date with somebody and you're taking them to the local botanical garden, maybe that's just the time to let go and just allow the stimulus of the environment to just guide your attention. Wow, look at that flower, it's so nice. If you're in a hyper-vigilant, concentrated state in that moment, that might be really imprudent. So these are some various pieces of an attentional act that themselves can be broken down and looked at from normative perspectives, okay? So that's sort of the general topography that I've been working with. Now what I want to do is take you inside the way Buddhist philosophers have been dealing with this phenomena for thousands of years. And I just want to note that for them, attention is really important. And the stakes are unimaginably high. So here's a quote from the Dhammapada, which I translate in the following way. Heedfulness is the way of the deathless. Heedlessness is the way of death. The heedful do not die. The heedless are as though dead already. So for these philosophers, attending well, being heedful is literally a matter of life and death. And I note here that this is a kind of attentional precursor to the philosophical zombie. The claim here is that if you are not paying attention to what's happening, you are dead. And I note also here, very briefly, an interesting contrast with Socrates' injunction in the Apology that the unexamined life is not worth living. That's a normative claim about worth, but your life is still being lived, just not in a worthy way. The Buddhists are even more hardcore. They're like, no, you're already dead. So this is life and death for them. Let's try and think about why. So to unpack some of the Buddhist views on this, and here I'm going to move from talking about the Dhammapada, which is a kind of collection of verses from the early canon. It's thought of as a kind of manual of like greatest hits. It was something that it's something that, if Buddhists were hanging out on the side of the road asking if you've heard the good word, they would give you a copy of the Dhammapada, because it contains these really nice, pithy verses that are designed to sort of be like, oh, do you want to hear more? Have you heard about our teacher, Siddhartha Gautama? Here, the Dhammapada. We're going to kind of transition from that kind of literature into some of the more technical, scholastic stuff that was, compiled by Buddhaghosa, who's sort of one of my favorite people, philosophically speaking. I don't know what he was like at dinner parties, but he's a very good philosopher. So 2 points here that I just want to extract from recent work that's been done by a colleague of mine, Janardhan Ganeri, who wrote a very interesting and dense book on Buddhaghosa that was published in 2017, where he and I are in strong agreement that attention is very much at the heart of Buddhaghosa's philosophical psychology. And Ganeri here notes that the world that these Buddhists are living in is one that is normatively alive, right? So our embodied minds are being constantly solicited by the world in which we live. And because of that, there's no element of our experience that's inert. We are all sort of embedded and responsive and reactive in different ways. And because the world is so alive with normative solicitation, the question of how we should take up with those solicitation becomes extremely pressing for these Buddhists. And this is a question about norms of attention, right? It's a question of what we should be heedful of and what should we ignore, because you can't pay attention to everything. So every time your experience is structured according to a goal, there's a question of where that goal is coming from and what you're ignoring in light of it, which is why they're so intense about moment-to-moment awareness of experience. It's an ethical project for them. And Buddhaghosa wants to note here, and Ganeri is exactly right when he emphasizes this, that empathy, our ability to pay it, is a kind of attentional ability that puts us in touch with other people. how we pay attention to others is a profound ethical project. And there are 4 canonical pro-social attitudes that we're going to talk about that can be understood as empathetic modes of attention to other subjects in our world around us. And my take on this is that what Buddhaghosa is providing us with here is a holistic model of existential attention and the norms that accompany it. And the cool thing about Buddhaghosa is he's going to claim that even when you get it right, even when you're a compassionate, loving, sympathetic, equanimous person, you can still get it wrong. Because even these positive, pro-social, empathetic modes of attention are biased. They're selective. They ignore things. And because of that, we can fall into certain traps, subtle ones, that I'm going to unpack for you in just a moment. So let's talk about the Brahma Viharas, the divine abodes. Here's a quote, middle of page 5 of your handout. Indeed, amongst these Brahma Viharas, there is metta, loving kindness, and that is for one who is of abundant malevolence. Karuna, or compassion, is for one of abundant cruelty. Mudita, sympathetic joy, is for one of abundant aversion. And upekkha, equanimity, is for one of abundant lust. This is the path to purification. And because benefits gather, non-benefits are taken away, attainments are enjoyed, and there is an absence of disinclination, one's fourfold attention to others is on account of these benefits. There's a lot going on here, and I've schematized it for you a little bit on this chart on the bottom of the page. But in essence, what he's saying here is that there are certain bad habits that we have, and attending to others in the right way is a medicine for those habits. So these 4 Brahma Viharas here are understood as peculiar and highly normatively constrained ways of paying attention to other sentient beings. And paying attention to others in this way is not just about how the attentional set discloses the other to one paying attention to them, but it also explains that in developing these skills of attention in the right way, which I'll explain in a minute, one is therefore on the path to purification. So attention is not only normatively accessible, it's malleable. And it's because the malleability of attention is what makes it normatively accessible, right? Because I have control, or because I can acquire some control over my attention, it's something I'm evaluable for. Okay? So here are the basics. I'm not going to go through this entire chart because there's a lot of jargon in here, but I'm going to just walk you through the basics. On the top of page 6, there's a really nice quote from Ganeri's book where he explains the way that Buddhaghosa individuates psychological concepts. He does so according to 4 different types of definition. It's very sophisticated. So he thinks in order to do conceptual analysis, to analyze the structure of a concept, we need 4 different accounts. One is an analysis of the distinctive characteristic of the phenomena that is individuated by the concept. And this analysis should also tell us about the function performed by the psychological kind, which is its task, the job it does within the mind. And we should also specify the proximate cause or immediate occasion for the arising of that psychological kind, and as well, how the psychological kind shows itself in the cognitive economy, how it influences other cognitive functions. Okay, and Buddhaghosa is going to also add to this success and failure conditions. So let's look at the chart for a minute. We'll work through one of the examples. Sympathetic joy. This is my favorite one. So sympathetic joy has the characteristic of being the gladness that is produced by others succeeding. And its function is to help you get rid of your envy. And it manifests itself in your cognitive economy by attenuating and eventually eliminating aversion, negative reactive attitudes, and boredom, indifference. And its proximate cause, the thing that causes it to arise, is the seeing of the success of others. Now, one of the interesting things about these attentional sets is they're self-reinforcing. We are gladdened when we cultivate sympathetic joy, we cultivate joy in sympathy with the successes of others. And the proximate cause of that is seeing the success of others. So part of what we're learning to do is pay attention to that and not some other thing. And the more we pay attention to that proximate cause, the more this particular form of attention shows up. The more this particular form of attention shows up, the more salient the proximate cause becomes. And this is true of all the others as well. When we choose to see what is lovable in others, when we focus on what is lovable in others, our love for others increases, and that affects how we attend to other people. So what Buddhaghosa is suggesting here is that we have the psychological capacity to augment our pre-reflective salience map of the world. That when we pay attention in certain cultivated ways, the way things show up for us starts to shift, because what we prioritize affects what shows up for us. And that this is a way in which we create a positive reinforcing loop. And I mentioned sympathetic joy here because academics are really bad at this one, right? We like, oh, congratulations, but like there's so much ladder climbing in academia. So I always like to, whenever I give academic talks, I always talk about sympathetic joy because it's one of those things that we all need to get better at. And he's giving us a very psychologically sophisticated way how to get better at it. It's to recognize that the choices we make about what we prioritize will affect what is spontaneously obvious to us. Okay? Now, the success and failure conditions go to another level of subtlety at this juncture. It's not enough for Buddhaghosa that we succeed in seeing what is lovable, and we fail when we are selfish. Because even when we succeed on a coarse level, there is another subtler layer in which we can fail. And he called to mind this subtler level of normative evaluability, he invokes the idea of near and far enemies. So you might recall from the passage I read a little earlier that each of these Brahma Viharas is a kind of antidote for a psychological opposite. So when we pay attention to others in a loving way, with loving kindness, when we generate metta, the far enemy is ill will and hatred. And that's obvious, right? That's the psychological opposite that it's directly designed to counteract. But he also thinks that our attention can be overwhelmed by subtle biases, even when we're in a loving mode of attention to the other. So for example, the near enemy, the close enemy of loving kindness is a kind of greed, the kind of needy, attached loving that comes, especially in romantic love, but also with parents and children, where we love the other person, but we also really love them, right? And it's that subtle attached agitation that seeps in, even when your intentions are good, even when your attention is good, that bias is there. Sympathetic joy is a really good example of this. The example I always go to is parents with kids who are in sports, right? Where little Timmy's a great soccer player. That's my son, right? Like mine. That kind of, like you're proud of your child. They're succeeding, but they're also mine. And like I am proud of them, right? There's this attachment and possessiveness that comes into it. And these are subtle things. And the point here is that Buddhaghosa is trying to make is that our minds are so pervasively and deeply agitated that even when we get it right, we can get it wrong. And so even in the context of hitting upon a correct attentional set, there is a risk that even these very pro-social qualities that structure the mind can become distorted and problematic. So here are some questions that are coming up for me at this juncture. First, what should we do about this? If our attention is that pervasively, effectively biased, what should we do about it? How should we train it? What kind of habits of attention should we cultivate? I don't want to just like play some bald mindfulness card here. That's boring and not helpful. Like, oh, well, we should practice mindfulness. No, that's not. It's not that simple, because the subtlety with which we are prone to getting left or right of the middle, as it were, to use some Buddhist rhetoric here, is so subtle that even the practice of meditation can just be a way of baking in your presuppositions. It should come as no surprise that most hardcore Buddhist meditators, when they get to very deep levels of concentration, come to a profound experiential realization that there's no self. That couldn't have anything to do with your antecedent commitment to the non-existence of a self, would it? Of course it does. And the same can go on the other side, right? Of course, Brahmanical philosophers, Advaita Vedantic, contemplatives are astounded by the non-dual unity of self and Brahman in the deeper states of yonic absorption. Because your antecedent commitments condition what shows up for you when you go into these subtler levels of contemplation. So it's not just a simple matter of drilling down into the sediments of our biases with the clear light of awareness and seeing things as they are. Because what shows up for you is a function of all the antecedent motivations that structure your goals. And that's the circle I'm trying to articulate here. So one answer that lots of Buddhist philosophers like to give, especially and not just Buddhist philosophers, but modern Buddhist psychologists. So these are like contemporary psychologists who think Buddhism is true, and Buddhist modernist exegetes who sell mindfulness. One answer they really like to give is that we should eliminate these biases through attentional cultivation. And what I want to do is provide a pushback against that particular way of doing things. And then I'll stop talking and we can have a conversation. So here's the question. Can we eliminate affective biases? My answer is going to be no, we can't. And therefore, the story I'm going to want to tell about what we should do about this will be very different. But some colleagues of mine wrote this really important and interesting article called Developing Attention and Decreasing Affective Bias. And it suggests that that this is possible, or at least desirable, and that this is the right way to read what these Buddhists are up to. And I'm going to argue against this. I don't think it's right. So two factors that Davis and Thompson use to articulate their cross-cultural cognitive science of attention cultivation come from their reconstruction of what's called satipatthana meditation. And what they're doing here is they're taking this procedure of meditation from the Pali literature, the cultivation of sati, mindfulness, and they're trying to analyze it with the categories of contemporary cognitive science. And what they do here is they claim that what satipatthana is about, what it's recommending is two things. One is that we develop subtler levels of phenomenal awareness, that we expand the aperture of our experiential threshold so that we are able to see or feel more that's going on in our embodied minds than we would ordinarily see or feel if we were just getting around in the world in an average, ordinary way. That's the first thing that they think satipatthana is doing. And the second thing it is doing, it is decreasing with an eye to eliminating affective biases that distort our attention. Why should we want to get rid of affective biases? Well, according to Davis and Thompson, they claim that to the degree that attention and memory are affectively biased, one is thereby less likely to consciously experience subtle emotional stimuli that do not fit one's biases. Thus, by decreasing affective biases and increasing alertness, cognitive understanding is enhanced. So I want to just be charitable here and note that there's a difference between decreasing biases or attenuating biases on the one hand and eliminating them on the other. And Davis and Thompson never used the language of elimination in their paper, but their logic suggests that they would embrace it if it were possible. And insofar as not possible, it would constitute as a problem that needs to be dealt with. So what I want to do here is note that there are two claims being made in the passage that I just cited, and I want to endorse the first claim and reject the second claim. So I endorse the claim that affective biases decrease the likeliness of becoming viscerally aware of subtle stimuli that do not fit with one's biases. I think that's right. But I want to reject the claim that what follows from this is that we should strive towards some objective awareness of stimuli, whereby the problematic influences of affect are replaced by a cognitive awareness or cognitive understanding that is devoid of affective biases. I think that's a non-starter. Okay. Why do I think that's a non-starter? I'm going to skip this bit at the bottom of page 7 and just give you the argument on the top of page 8. And then when I'm done that, I'll say a couple of concluding remarks and then we can do some questions. So here's the argument. First, attending, as we've seen, is a matter of selecting and ignoring. And what is attended to is selected and what is not attended to is ignored. Definition. Now, what gets selected and ignored is modulated in part by the goals of a subject, whether those goals are explicitly thematized or not. So what is relevant to you affects what you look for, and your goals, implicit and explicit, exercise a modulating influence over your attention sets and condition what you look for actively, and therefore what shows up for you passively. Third premise, a subject's goals are in turn modulated by affective biases. I've already argued for this premise. Now, it's controversial and requires a lot more empirical data to support, which I can provide you with if you want. But I think our previous discussion of the pervasiveness of affective bias should be enough, at least to start getting sympathetic for this particular premise, right? Our capacity to attend is motivated in a primal way by our need to avoid pain and acquire pleasure. And the first conclusion that follows for this is that what gets selected and ignored is therefore modulated by affective biases. And therefore all attention is effectively biased in some way. But if all attention is effectively biased in some way, then eliminating affective biases is not a viable strategy for normatively assessing and training attention. Therefore, it follows that eliminating affective biases is not a viable strategy for normatively assessing or training attention. If that argument's sound, then we need some other strategy for what we should do about the pervasiveness of our bias. And what I'm going to do very briefly, my conclusion is suggest what I think that might be. The first is that don't try and eliminate your biases. It's impossible. Affective biases are how salience is constructed. And it's how your experience remains manageable in light of overwhelming sensory perturbation. Instead, what we should do is pick biases that maximize the kinds of salience that you want and attenuate whatever sorts of salience you reject. So from an empirically informed argument about this, you can see Todd and colleagues, they have a really neat argument for why affectively biased attention is a kind of proactive emotion regulation. But here's the point. I'm agnostic about whether the Buddhists are right about the kinds of attention we should want. So for example, they don't think you should get angry. Buddhists are basically like, don't get angry. That's a bad move. I'm kind of open to that, right? I think there are places where anger might be an important, functionally irreducible element of our moral psychology, and attending to the world in an angry way can get you certain sorts of salience you might not be able to get without it. But what I think they're absolutely right about is that picking biases that harmonize with your antecedent normative commitments is the best possible answer we have to the problem of being pervasively affectively biased. And one suggestion I will make that I think tries to recover the Buddhist dimension of this from the reading of Buddhaghosa that I have offered in this talk is to claim the following existential attention norm, which is the first object of your attention should always be the body. Because the body is the place where contact gives rise to feelings. And through the body, you can then cultivate these pro-social modes of attention, which give you access to the world in a way that will harmonize with the norms embodied in those modes of attention. And again, I've tried to remain agnostic about whether compassion, sympathetic joy, loving kindness, and equanimity are the right content. I think we could sub in and out for that for independent reasons. But the structure, I think, is basically right because it gives us self-awareness of our own predicament without trying to escape from a circle that literally defines the horizon of our subjectivity. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you for your attention. I will happily take your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. So I already see some hands going up. Just to make it clear, I would like to prioritize graduate students. This is a moment you really maximize your affective biases. Okay, so Ian Nicolai, I think you were first. Were you raising your hand or were you clapping your hand?
Those were clapping hands, but I could
Oh,
ask
okay.
a question. I have several, so just as well either way. I hadn't picked exactly which one I was going to ask though, so I'm just going to go with the first one I had. Thank you, Sean, for your talk. I really enjoyed. You know, this one's a little vague, but I was. It seems to me, you know, your position is lining up on the side of maybe Gadamer's departure from Heidegger and maybe McDowell's disagreement with Dreyfus. So I just wanted to raise that and hear if you could, you know, explicitly connect and compare or contrast, or say how maybe my hunch on that point is not quite right, anything along those lines. And I have some other down the line questions. So, but
yeah, so
lucky to go first.
Yeah, so procedurally, what we'll do is let's give everyone a chance. I will stay in this room until all questions have been answered, but we'll go one at a time. So I'll answer this question, and then we'll let everyone else who has a question ask a question, and then I'll just stay here until all your questions have been answered. Is that fair? Okay, so it's a great question. My short answer is basically yes, but with the following caveat about the McDowell comparison. I think that this debate about conceptual versus non-conceptual content and perception that is sort of at the heart of disputes in that literature is, you know, the Dreyfus-McDowell debate, I think, is really grounded in very specific readings of Kant on McDowell's part, and very specific readings of Heidegger on Dreyfus's part. And I don't think I endorse either reading. So for me, the dispute looks a little bit misconceived. And there's sort of a Buddhist philosophical reason that I have for that, as well as a cognitive scientific one, which is that I think a lot of those disputes go away when we make the following distinction: the distinction between full-blown concepts and proto-concepts. So a full-blown concept is going to be a mental representation that has propositional structure and semantic content. A proto-concept is going to be something like an equivalence class that's structuring perception. And so, is perception conceptual? It's proto-conceptual, but I don't think it's full-blown conceptual. And so where I'm on board with McDowell is the idea that the world is not available to us in this sort of smooth, naturalistic way that he critiques Gareth Evans on. But I think both Dreyfus and McDowell are of the view that our direct apprehension of reality is structured by norms, and then they just are, you know, for Dreyfus, it's this mindless practical norm that makes us, because he has this sort of like practical know-how reading of Heidegger going on, and that know-how is guided by sensitivity to norms that are kind of non-cognitive, whereas McDowell, I apologize, thinks, no, this is much more intellectual in a way. So for me, I just think that debate is sort of problematic for reasons I've outlined, but I think both of them agree, and that our primary contact with the world through perception is laden with normativity. And the Buddhists agree with that, but I think that their categories give us room to make a distinction between the sort of proto-conceptual and the full-blown semantic representations that happen in thought. And then when we keep that distinction alive in our minds, this debate about conceptual, non-conceptual content and perception becomes far less interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. And yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah. No. Ian, you have a brief follow-up?
Oh, I was just saying, Gadamer is the main name I think of with, kind of rehabilitating the dirty words of bias and prejudice. And maybe those are too laden and some different vocabulary is needed. But I was just wondering if there's any to say about Gadamer there also.
I don't know enough about him to say anything intelligent. I think that his ability to, I think that his critique of Heidegger in the sense that he's, we don't, just by being practically embedded in the world, we are not in touch with like the fundamental being of everything. We are in touch with a world that like is reflective of commitments that we are projecting onto it. And that's a kind of hermeneutical circle. I think he's right.
And he says, like you, that they, give one the horizon of understanding for certain things.
Yeah.
That's why I thought your position resonated with his the most.
Totally. Thank you.
Thank you. Roll.
Thank you. I'll just ask one question now. Yeah, I was just saying, I think I broadly agree with the whole project, so I'm just going to ask, just kind of maybe it's a bit of a clarification. What would be a relationship that isn't affective bias? Because you were discussing affective, you gave examples, and I'm just kind of curious about one that wouldn't be considered affective bias, and if that is, if it's even so common as to be at all relevant. Yeah.
Well, I guess the point I was trying to make is that I don't, affect, feeling is the primary form of contact through which the world is made salient to us. So the idea that there's some sort of outside of that is the point I'm like disagreeing with.
All right, that's what I thought. So I mean, yeah, it doesn't. So it doesn't seem like there is a non-affective bias. So that, yeah, that's why, because you brought up the term as if there was, it was already.
Okay, I think I understand the question now. There are biases that aren't. There are biases that we could individuate that aren't. So it might turn out psychologically that all forms of bias ground out in certain primal reactive attitudes to affects. But we might think that at the level of concepts that we individuate forms of bias that aren't constitutively effective in terms of how we understand them, right? So, a rational bias, a bias that's like compromising your rationality, might not be conceptually affective in nature. Psychologically, it is, right? Like we are just, I'm very Humean in this way, right? It's just like it's feelings at the bottom level, and then we construct abstract categories on the basis of that. But once we get to that level, there could be different types of biases that aren't conceptually defined by affective reactions. But my claim would be psychologically, it's going to bottom out there. Does that make sense?
Yep, that makes perfect sense.
Okay.
Okay, Lok Trey.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much for Professor Sean for giving such an insightful presentation. I would like to ask some questions about the second conclusion that you draw at the last page. You say that like in order to eliminate our affective bias is to like pick those so-called good bias or realize some state we antecedently reject. So like it seems to me that like it requires a second level of awareness to realize what is the good bias and what is the thought that we get rid of before. So my question is if we do have affective biases, then how can we develop this second level of awareness to realize what is good bias or what is the previous thought that we get rid of? Yeah, so this is my question. Thank you.
It's a great question. It's a great question. So I don't know if my answer will satisfy you, but basically what I would want to say about this particular problem is that there is a very close reciprocal relationship between the way in which the mind enters into a state of self-awareness. It starts to think about, reflect on its own activity, and the sort of first order embedded responsive kind of awareness that keeps us stitched into our world. And what I'm prescribing here is just to recognize that relationship, right? So the sort of cheeky answer is like, do ethics, right? Like, do ethical theory and come to a rational conclusion about what's best. And then recognize that having arrived at that conclusion, you're subject to certain biases that lead you to take certain forms of argument and evidence as being more relevant than others. You can't escape that, but recognize it. And then pay attention to your world in a way that reflects those commitments and see what happens. Right? Be a scientist about it. So if you're noticing that like certain things about your behavior and activity are generating problems for you, make a change, right? Like it's a practical point, right? I'm not trying to solve the problem of ethics here. It's more that I want us to be aware of the complex recursive relationship that exists between second order reflective equilibrium and theoretical attitudes and the sort of pre-reflective, engaged, absorbed attitude of attention that keeps us moving in the world, and to know there's a conditioning relationship between them. And if you're aware of that fact, that will give you some agency, because you start to realize you actually have a little bit of control over things that look passive to you. Because things just show up as salient. When you walk down the street, a beautiful person, someone who just shows up to you is just like a radiant, gorgeous person, they just show up, right? And you ignore everyone else. But that's because they have certain qualities that you are pre-reflectively oriented towards. So you can make choices about what those orientations look like by consciously attending to certain things. And it's that relationship that the normative claim, the prescription I'm making is get self-conscious about that relationship and live a coherent life. Does that help?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
very good. Thank you.
Neil?
Hi, Sean.
Hi,
Great talk.
thanks.
I want to push back maybe a little bit on this point at the bottom of page 7.
Sure.
And I want to, as a foil, I want to use the historical Buddha.
Okay.
He seems to have had at least 2 teachers. One of them is thought to be a Sankhyan, who should have at least potentially given him an antecedent notion that there should be a self, yet he didn't find one. So it's not as obvious as it might seem to be that our antecedent commitments lead to us finding what we anticipate.
Yeah, good. Yeah, that's a nice example. I mean, what I would say to that is that there's a sort of war of examples that we could get into here. And that I don't claim to have a knockdown cake recipe for what you're going to find when you go exploring, right? And the Buddhist narrative is constructed in a way where you're right, he does encounter certain things that would lead him in a certain direction, and that this doesn't look like he's just baking in his presuppositions. But that's the story, right? Like what I'm trying to talk about is psychologically what's realistic. It is, of course, internal to the narrative of the Buddha's enlightenment that he has discovered the law. And I guess what I'm just trying to say is, that comparison I made between not self and self, I'm being like 30% cheeky there, right? Like there might be a bunch of other reasons and extra psychologically relevant factors that would lead one to the belief that there is no self, or to the experience of subtler levels of cognitive functioning in which selfing ceases. My point is simply that there are a plurality of such narratives, all of which carry with them divergent metaphysical commitments about what's found. And so the idea that I'm just going to close my eyes and turn the flashlight of awareness on and in and just see things as they actually are, that's a little naive. Right? It doesn't mean that it's a failed project. It doesn't mean that the practice of refining awareness in contemplative experience is just a matter of baking in antecedently endorsed views, especially if you take a kind of like metacognitive, hypervigilant, skeptical attitude, which is something that is present in a number of different traditions. I'm just trying to point to the fact that the mind is very subtle like this, and you know, Buddhist philosophy is aware of this fact, and that's why I'm talking about Buddhist philosophy now. But I wasn't trying to dismiss the Buddha's enlightenment as just like a you know, a wish-fulfilling pipe dream. I was simply trying to point out that there is this recursive dynamic between salience and antecedent endorsement, and that relationship is structured by attention, and being self-aware about that is really important. That's all, right?
That seems to be a claim about that would push more to the side of interpretation rather than actual phenomenology.
Well, yes, but you might think that phenomenology is a kind of interpretation, right? Like the thematizing of phenomenology is defined, among other things, methodologically as the explicit thematization of pre-reflective self-consciousness. And the act of thematization always carries with it a certain stopping of experience in order to turn the gaze onto it. So that's something that phenomenology is interpretation. Like, how could it not be, given how many people disagree about it? If you just look at the history of phenomenology, it's just like Husserl couldn't even agree with himself. Of course it's interpretation. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. This is the fact that there's a hermeneutic dimension to the act of thematizing pre-reflective consciousness is precisely why I think Husserl says of phenomenology that it is an infinite task. Right? I mean, yeah, that's my view.
All right. Taylor.
Hi, thank you for your talk, Sean. So I was thinking a similar question as Lok Chui about, you know, our antecedent, the reflection on our antecedent commitments also being affected by affective bias. And so I was kind of thinking that you might be setting yourself up for something like if you were to go this route, if one were to, like a quasi-realism, something like Blackburn's quasi-realism, which McDowell is like very critical of, because it, you know, means you don't have substantive truth conditions. You just basically have logical consistencies among affective biases. But setting that point aside, I think one way in which you could say that our reflection of our antecedent normative commitments is not as affected by affective bias is maybe you could just, if you agree, you could distinguish between different ways of attending. So I could attend to a proposition in a way of asserting its truth, or I can attend to it in a way that's doubting it. I can attend to a red apple in front of me, or I can attend to an apple through memory retrieval. And so maybe you could argue that these different modes of attending have a different type of affective bias that makes it so that reflecting on our normative commitments isn't as subject to affective bias. Would that be something that's that's something that Husserl would do. Maybe the Husserlian inside of you would be open to that suggestion, but would something in Buddhaghosa be sympathetic to that?
I'm not sure I understand the question, so I apologize if I'm being a bit thick, but is the idea that like there are certain places in our psychology where we're just less, this problem doesn't show up as worse? It's like not as bad some places? Is that, you know?
Yeah, like I don't know, you said like there's a first order level where we're like constitutively like engaged with the phenomena, and then there's like this higher order level where we're reflecting on that. And so maybe in that reflective state, you're not as summoned by the world.
Yeah, but yeah, that's right. But what I don't want to do is make a dichotomy here. You know, when I start to reflect on my interpersonal commitments, I'm not kind of suspending them. You know, the reflective moment is a moment that's still embedded in my commitments to the people I care about. So, you know, the place where I would say I'm less stressed out, like I'm not a skeptic about perception, for example. Like I'm not worried about that. I recognize, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the way in which perceptual salience is constructed is powerfully dependent on affective biases. That's why objects in perception show up for you as soliciting action. Right? That's why this water bottle looks like a source of satiation and not just a turquoise cylinder. But those biases don't impact really my ability to deal with my environment. In fact, they enhance it. But in the context that I'm discussing in the paper, it's about interpersonal relationships and ethical commitment. That's a place where like it is very easy to get into your own head in a way where, you know, what should I do? What should I say? How can I fix it? These are questions that happen in the reflective moment that can often paralyze engagement with the people that we care about, just as often as being heedless and just like running along with your feelings can get you into problems as well. So we in the context of interpersonal relationships and ethical obligations and various ways in which we're normatively evaluable to ourselves and others, we go wrong, not just in the reflective moment, though we do often do that because we're bad at reflecting, but we go wrong by just being immersed and overwhelmed and excited and just agitated as well. So for me, the place where the pervasiveness of affective bias does not constitute as much of a worry is the place where the world itself can just kind of push us in ways where we all tend to pre-reflectively coordinate our behavior. Like I'm not worried that the ground, you know, that the bridge is going to collapse when I walk over it, even though I know that what it took to construct it was a lot of people having feelings. It doesn't show up for me as a stressor, you know. So I don't know, like I have a lot of moral terror. So I like, for me, like when I go into like the reflective attitude about my own ethical commitments, I'm often like, did I do the right thing? I don't know. Like, I don't know what the right thing is. Like I get very skeptical. So maybe for you or for others, there's a place where ethical reflection is less subject to those affective biases. For me, I feel like that's where they're the most active. But maybe that's just because I think too much. Right? It could be subject relative. I'm worried I'm not addressing the heart of your question, but I promise you I'm doing my best. Did I do okay, or do you need me to say more?
No, I mean, that's a really good response. I guess it just makes it even more crucial that you will be able to break out of the cycle of reinforcing your affective biases.
This is why talking to other people is really helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dave? Dave, you're muted.
Oh, yes, I know. I was looking for the button. Sorry. Attention is sort of on the boundary between conscious and unconscious activity. It's sort of volitionally influenced, but not perfectly volitional. And so I'm wondering whether it's really the attention itself that we want to normatively evaluate, or the prioritization that you mentioned that influences our attention, and attention is just kind of evidence of something else that's gone wrong, and that's what should be evaluated. Does that make any sense?
Ask me one more time.
Okay. Attention seems to me to be not fully volitional. It's not something that I control.
Yes.
And you talked about how our other prioritizations can influence that and influence what we pay attention to. And I'm saying, okay, well then is it the thing we normatively evaluate, or is it just kind of the surface evidence of something else, a deeper problem that we need to address?
Good. Yeah, so that's right. And I guess the point that I would make, here for a moment, just wearing a Buddhist philosophical hat, is that control over attention is something that's acquired, not something that's given. It's something that is cultivated over time. If you tried right now to place your awareness on one thing and keep it there, my guess is that you could probably do it for 3 to 5 seconds before something else came into your mind and took your attention away. But if you practice every day for hours, you can learn to be more focused. Now that's top-down attention, but passive, spontaneous attention can also be trained. That's the point. One of the points I'm trying to make. So one way you can do this is by getting really good at something. People who are experts at things, like dancers and musicians, really good at letting their spontaneous attention wander, or entering to a state where you're not paying attention to a thing, you're simply just letting the system act in a fluid, skillful way, and you're monitoring for deviations from the norm. This is one way to describe expert attention. You're not hyper focused on the task because you're so good at what you're doing that the goal is just to let go and relax and let your muscle memory take over. But you need to pay attention in a way where whenever some tension arises in the body, you relax the muscle or whatever it is. So attention is something that can be trained, and because it can be trained, we can gain control over it where we might not have had control before. And it is that potential, that window of potential, that plasticity that makes it normatively evaluable. And you're absolutely right to say that much of what guides our spontaneous attention in life is coming from this underlying reactive reservoir that just kind of pushes us around, whether it's the world stimulating us or our subconscious just pushing us. That's right. And the Buddhists agree with you. And their point is the only way to get some agency over that so that you're not a moral nightmare to everyone around you is to train your attention so that your habitual reaction to stimulus, either coming in from the senses or coming up from the bottom of the recesses of your associative unconscious, come through an aperture of self-awareness before behavior results immediately from your reactions to what's happening. And that's the place where you gain agency and therefore responsibility. Does that make sense?
I think I hear you saying that our predispositions can influence our attitude, our attention. But if we train our attention, we can get it to go the other way. So if we control our attention, that will influence our predispositions.
Correct.
In a good way.
That's right.
Potentially.
Yep.
Okay. Thanks for your talk.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right, Mike.
Oh yeah, thank you for the talk, of course. I'd like 2 minor points. You say that canonical states of affairs over which norms tend to hold are beliefs, actions, and intentions. And I'm wondering if there is a reason you didn't include things like desire states as being normatively accessible as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. Just ignorance.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I was just trying to, honestly, what I was thinking of there was just virtue ethics, consequentialism, and deontology.
Okay, that clarifies.
Right? So I was just like, here are things that like core ethical theorists tend to take as given. And look, attention plays a constitutive psychological role in realizing these sorts of states that ethical theorists take as given. Therefore, this is at least an initial motivation for thinking about attention. But having unwholesome desires is, paradigm for sure.
Okay, and then the second one is I just wanted clarification on the relationship between affective salience and effectively biased attention.
Yeah.
I'm wondering like what the extra work that effectively biased attention is doing. So like affective salience, you say, is the tendency of an object to stand out relative to its surroundings due to its association in the subject between the object's significance and its effective emotional arousal. So this already seems like attentional to me as already.
Yeah, maybe it is. Here's a way to distinguish the two and why you need both. Salience is a way of describing a property of an object that is available to awareness. Effectively, a biased attention is a way of describing a psychological act that brings an object into awareness such that it is salient for a subject. So there's something going on in me that brings the object into my awareness, and there's something going on with the object that makes it solicit my awareness. Salience is the solicitory property of the object, and the attention is the psychological act which gets the salience in view.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like, I don't know, it's just like the term bias, I think maybe there's just a little bit of a, I don't know, negativity associated with it. Yeah, so like you could like substitute with something that's like more neutral and it would be like the same assertion that you're making.
Yeah, there is a kind of pejorative connotation to the term. And I guess part of the background here is for me, when you start to think carefully about how perception actually works, you're kind of forced to realize that the gating systems that intelligently ignore information to get you something like a conscious percept is just littered with biases. And so that for me, a bias is, it doesn't have that pejorative connotation. It's a descriptive term that is just a way of describing various ways that we intelligently ignore huge swaths of information.
Okay, thank you.
Edward?
Hey, Sean, thanks for the talk, of course. So I guess I have a question about your conclusion coming from this, and it just might need more explanation, and maybe I don't fully understand the point. But you seem to say that you weren't gonna necessarily tie yourself to the preferred Buddhist canonical states that would come out of something like this, and you said no. I think anger might have a place or something else like that. But if we're gonna define this methodology to even be aware of what our affective biases are, maybe to go to your case example of going back and forth of, am I an optimist, am I a pessimist? It seems as though to put myself in a place where I'm considering both those equally even, or consider yourself, kind of starts to develop its own content where you start to value them in an equal way, which would then maybe result in these wholesome states that the Buddhist philosophers would defend. And I'm just curious how this training of the attention that you seem to argue here for isn't going to result in that, or how you think that's possible.
So is it kind of like an empirical claim, which is something like, look, if you cultivate attention in these ways, it looks like we're just going to end up with these certain wholesome biases as a like the calming and concentrating of awareness will just like naturally result in a compassionate attitude, something like that?
I think it's partially that, or even like the effectively biased attention, something like you were talking about, like a high state of sexual arousal or something like that, that really is going to narrow down anyone's attention. So for me to say, okay, I have this bias, to take that first recursive step and then pay attention to it seems to push myself towards that place of equanimity. And that's going to require me to not be in that state anymore. It would seem like it'd be the same thing with anger or anything else that the Buddhist would push back on.
Yeah, but remember, what I'm suggesting isn't that you retreat to some quasi-neutral reflective state. It's just to recognize that everything that's salient to you is the product of a motivational set that's structuring your attention. And that you potentially have access to that recursive mechanism if you pay attention to yourself in the right way. And the empirical point is hard to prove, right? Like, I don't want to be facetious or dismissive here, but I can tell you, like, having spent many years meditating, like, and more hours meditating than you probably imagine, actually, I'm still a fairly agitated person. I've met people who have, you know, spent months and months and months meditating, and they're just completely agitated. So I don't think that there's any immediate cake recipe psychologically for what happens, because when you do this stuff, because human beings are so complicated and individual because of their personal histories. And so when you start to train self-awareness in these subtler ways, there are things that happen that you know, thousands of years of contemplative traditions have mapped out for us in many ways. Not all of it's good. So, and it is obviously in the interest of these traditions to have a cake recipe that leads to a destination that's desirable. And of course, they're going to emphasize that part of it in their instructions to you. But the human mind is evolving and changing, and the conditions under which it lives and the conditions under which it cultivates self-awareness are changing. And I think that those contingencies are massively important for thinking about what happens. And that's sort of what I'm talking about, is like your perspective, your subjectivity, your embodiment is a window as much as it is a prison. And recognizing that is important for being an appropriately self-aware person. I don't think there's any eventuality that comes. I think it's choices that we make about how to interpret our experience. Yeah, I mean, I could say more here, but have I said enough, or should I say more?
I think it's good for now. Thank you.
All right, William.
Okay, so great talk, Sean. I know that you're thinking about biases, and so my question is going to be about something that's not specifically attentional, but rather actional. So there are things that my attention gets drawn to, say a messy room, or the state of my knees when I go to sleep, for instance, a feeling of discomfort that can't be easily satisfied at that moment, or that takes some kind of effort to satisfy, or even a dispositional change. And so those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about, the kinds of attentions or experiences that I'm thinking about. And so I'm wondering how these are what I think is that these are the sorts of things that have to be engaged with, not at the level of changing my attention to them, or changing my bias with respect to them, but changing my action. So, for example, exercising more, or cleaning my room regularly. So do you see a way in which this kind of habit building or habit forming fits in with attention?
Yeah. Here's yeah, it's a great question. So my response would be something like this. Have you ever, I'm sure all of us have been in a situation where maybe we're talking with a friend or a family member, a loved one, and the loved one is struggling with something, like, I really need to do this more. And you're like, well, yeah, just do it. And then they tell you where to go. Right. And the reason they're telling you where to go is because if it was simply a matter of changing my behavior, and I had the ability to do that, I wouldn't be talking to you about this. So by the time the behavior becomes problematic enough that it's become reflected upon, it's already habitual. So the simple changing of the behavior isn't really easy, right? This is why, addiction is so hard. So I mentioned this at the very outset of the talk. Oftentimes, when we're thinking about behavior or action under some norm, the psychologically relevant piece of the puzzle there is the extent to which attention is succeeding or failing to guide the action or behavior. And so I would say to you that the starting place for changing behavior is to recognize where your attention is. That doesn't mean you can't change your behavior, right? Like sometimes you have to force yourself. But like for me, I'll just lay my cards on the table. I had a very serious spinal injury last year, and I had to go through like 6 months of physiotherapy to, figure out how to not be in pain all the time. It was awful. And we got to a point where we, released the nerves and the muscles were no longer sprained, and I wasn't like in pain all the time, and I wasn't on opiates, and it was fine. And my physiotherapist was like, okay, you're ready. You need to do these exercises every day. I don't do them. I don't. I should. A doctor told me to. A literal spine doctor was like, so if you don't want to be in traction for the rest of your life, you need to do these exercises every day. Like, okay, I'm not doing it. Why? I'm too tired. I have too much work. I have a list of excuses, and they're all reasonable. Well, what's more important? Some part of me is making a choice about priorities. And the only way I'm going to force myself to get back to a place where I'm doing that behavior and I'm getting up every day and I'm spending that 30 to 60 minutes working those, is if I'm paying attention. Like, do you want to be crippled? No, then do the thing. But I'm not doing the thing, right? So the problem with intervening at the level of behavior, like normatively speaking, yes, that tends to be where we stop. Like, don't punch babies, obviously. The action is what matters. But how do you change the behavior? What's going on in your mind? Most of us don't have that level of control over our behavior. And if we did, we wouldn't have half the problems that we do.
So you're saying that behaviors still refer back to attention or our biases at some level, and that's still the level at which we have to modify.
That's right.
Okay.
Emma?
Thanks, Sean. My internet was cutting out at various points, so I'm sorry if some of what I say has already been addressed. As I think you know, I'm very sympathetic to the view that attention is normatively evaluable, but I'm also aware of a sort of standard objection to this sort of view, which goes something like paying attention to our affective biases requires paying attention to our bodies. But of course, some of us are better positioned to pay attention to our bodies than others. I'm thinking of those who have undergone traumatic experiences, or perhaps those who have been conditioned to ignore their bodily feelings because of flawed ideologies regarding race or sex or gender. So I'm just wondering, in your view, do you think that some people should be exempt from normative evaluation regarding their attention? Or exempt to different degrees regarding the conditions that give rise to their inability to pay attention to their bodies?
Good. Yeah, it's a good objection. This is not the first time I've heard this objection. The objection is basically, is your view ableist?
Right.
No, it isn't. For the following reasons. First, the scope of what I'm trying to do here isn't ideal ethical theory. What I'm up to is two things. I'm doing a kind of empirical survey of how we actually behave, right? And one of the things I've tried to note is like, we are actually collectively massively in the habit of evaluating each other's attention. We're doing it a lot. Worth noting that we're doing that a lot. That's sort of the starting point. The place where it gets more explicitly normative is just to say, one of the reasons why attention is normatively evaluable is because it's under our control, or at least potentially under our control. To the extent that a situation or an individual is not able to do these sorts of, like if you're not able to pay attention in a certain way, you're not evaluable for that, right? Or if you are, it's way less, right? Like this is like the court of common sense here, right? It's just like if someone does something wrong and they didn't mean to, or they couldn't help it, we don't hold them as responsible as someone who sat there and planned it out, right? So of course there are subject relative situations where individuals are psychologically or maybe even physically less self-aware, less able to engage in these kinds of practices. And to be clear, I am not trying to suggest that everyone should practice Buddhist meditation. That's an absurd recommendation, one that I am not making. In fact, I recommend that most people don't, because it's way too intense. Like, it's not fun. What I'm simply trying to say is that psychologically, we do have some agency, or the potential to cultivate some agency, and that one of the hallmarks of holding someone accountable is, could you have done otherwise? Yes, you're responsible. No? Okay, then we will have to evaluate the behavior on the basis of those mitigating factors relative to consequences. Right? So what I'm not doing is saying this is the only thing that matters. Of course, consequences matter. Of course, capacities matter. All of these things matter. I'm simply trying to add another piece in to the complex normative tapestry. Does that help?
Oh yeah, totally.
Okay.
I think the wrinkle that I am interested in is that some people are effectively unable to attend to their bodies not because they really lack the capacity, but because they've been told, for example, that men shouldn't feel sad or cry or whatever.
Right.
And in that case, they are not exempt from culpability in the way that somebody who has undergone trauma would be. So but I think that your response can accommodate that kind of distinction. So.
Got it. Cool. Thank you.
We're still leaving faculty behind. Daniel?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the wonderful talk. So I'm very much on board with the general picture, but I was wondering if I could hear a little bit more about what the implications are with respect to the cultivation or training of attention. So I have kind of two concerns. You brought up the literature on expertise and expert attention. As you probably know, although experts are paragons of attention, their attentional capacities are limited to the particular domain in which they practice. So the fact that a chess master can maintain focus on chess for 14 hours at a stretch, or a musician can maintain intense. So this is kind of one thing, that attentional training tends to be very restricted to particular domains. Whereas what you're calling for is a much more general thing, right? You're calling for a situation where attentional training can allow us to meet the many varied and multi-textured aspects of daily life. So one concern is that, why think that attentional training of the kind promoted by Buddhist meditation is going to transfer to daily life? And in support of my sort of skepticism here, the sort of largest meta-analysis on the health benefits of meditation, which collected about 18,000 studies, after comparing to active controls, found no benefits of meditation training for any aspect of health, including attentional training. So I suppose, although I agree with the general picture, I may be much less sanguine than you are about the prospects for actually intervening on the relevant processes. I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, so there's 2 points here. Let's see. The first point was something about the limits of the view relative to domain specificity of expertise in attention. And then the second point was like Buddhist meditation doesn't do anything. So regarding—
Sorry, so just to clarify, I mean, maybe it does, but I suppose the worry is that maybe people get very, very good at concentrating when they're sitting on a meditation seat or sitting at the top of a mountain or something like that. The idea is that like, there's no evidence, we don't have any particularly compelling evidence that it's going to translate to the context that we actually care about.
That's a complicated question because it's not clear that we're in a position to empirically measure that. Right? Like, I'll take a look at the study, obviously, but you know, measuring well-being that's a trick for sure. I mean, I don't want to dismiss the point because, you know, I'm a skeptic as much as the next person is actually, but I guess the point, what I would say is attentional expertise in specific domains can have a lopsiding effect. And I want to take that point, right? Like I used to be obsessed with chess and I had no friends for a long time. So like I take that point and I think it's important. Regarding the more general issue, yeah, I think that, okay, 2 things to say here. The first thing I want to say is I definitely think the jury is out on, you know, how this massive influx of mindfulness-based practices in contemporary psychology, what it's actually doing. So, you know, we get these meta-analyses and there are people who are like, yo, like, let's pump the brakes a bit. We shouldn't be more skeptical. And then we have people like Nietzsche Narrative and Judson Brewer, who are just like, this is literally going to solve all the world's problems. And I guess I just want to say I'm somewhere in the middle of that. I do think that we are living in a world of hyper-stimulation and being a bit more vigilant and filtered about the way that stimulation is directing the course of our lives is a benefit to us empirically. Philosophically, my point is maybe a little bit more abstract than this. It is that what shows up for you is obvious, is a function of antecedent psychological processes that you could potentially have access to. And so that in addition, it's not just about training attention to be more concentrated on something. It's not, the point I'm making is not that, you know, pay attention to everything. It's not, I don't envision us all walking around with like laser focus. I tried to be a bit more exploratory about that when I was talking about different parts of attention and different types of norms in different ways. Like sometimes you need to be free flowing and open and relaxed and passive, and other times more vigilant and metacognitive in the direction of your awareness. My point is simply to try and open that up as like a domain within which normative thinking is relevant and valuable. And the specific point that I want to say is like, because we have independent reasons to think that our attention is massively biased by our affective responses, getting more awareness of of that fact as it's operating in us in real time can give us agency where we might not have had any before. Yeah, I worry that I haven't fully addressed the depth of your concern, but that's as good as I have for right now.
No. So as I say, I agree completely with the kind of general picture. The concern was more about, you know, sort of what the prospects of
Right.
addressing these things with meditation in particular. Yeah, the general point I think is a very good one.
Yeah, and maybe meditation isn't the thing, right? There are other ways of training attention.
Yeah, so given that you seem generally sympathetic to the idea that we are kind of embodied, embedded agents, we can also, of course, control our attention by restructuring our environments in various ways. And of course, as I say, it's clear that various kinds of experts do cultivate incredible attentional abilities, and further that they cultivate the ability to shift attentional states flexibly to respond to environment, right? So it's not skepticism broadly about either the capacities for improving attention or skepticism about the fact that we ought to. I suppose the concern is much more limited to the maybe skepticism about the benefits of certain meditative practices. And again, I agree with you. I think we should be agnostic. I just think that the current state of empirical evidence is massively overstated.
Yeah. Okay, so we actually agree.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We are approaching 4:30. So, Sean, do you have access to the chat box?
I do have access to the chat box. I saw a really good question from Tamara
Yes.
a little while ago that I think needs to be addressed. There's been a lot of chatter since then that I have not kept up with. Let's see here. I'm just scrolling back.
So if you can, selectively comment upon faculty, questions and remarks over here, I think that would
Yeah,
be great.
do you guys just want to tell me your points with words so and we can have a conversation?
I'm fine with that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I did write words, but I can also speak them.
Speak
You're right. Yeah. Okay. No, I'm when I hear attention in a philosophical context, the first philosopher who comes to my mind is Simone Weil. I wrote my master thesis on her work, and so she for her it's a very important mechanism. And Arendam is right. There is also the waiting for God, but she speaks of attention also when a political solution is needed, and you don't want to rush it, and so you have to self-empty and create that inner focus, and then look at the contradictions or whatever needs to be resolved. And she says you have to hang in there, right? And it will hurt, but you have to do it because otherwise you won't be truthful in whatever solution you may find. So, and I was curious, since suffering is also associated with Buddhism, so I was curious whether in what some of that appears.
Yeah, I've a number of my colleagues who do work on this stuff, Nick Bomarito and Janardhan Ganeri, have turned their attention to Weil recently for this reason. I'm a little behind them. So what I'll say in response is coming from a place of ignorance, or what I do know is filtered through my engagements with other people, other Buddhist philosophers who think Weil is important for reasons similar to what you're saying, Tamara. One thing I've noticed, I think, that's different is that Weil's conception of attention is it's idiosyncratic, and there's a sort of I think what she's talking about is very much in line with what I talk about in terms of the holistic side of attention and the way it sort of provides governance and the glue for all the other parts of our minds. The Buddhist philosophers I'm talking about, their conception of the way the mind fills time is much more punctate and momentary. And so there's a fundamental difference in thinking about attention as this sort of a kind of diachronically extended orientation where you let things come, which I think is more what I'm hearing from your reconstruction of Weil. And that's to be contrasted, I think, a little bit with certain versions of the way Buddhists talk about this stuff, where it's much more about moment to moment to moment. But in general, I think that the Buddhists see attention and its cultivation as an antidote to suffering, and it is through the cultivation of a calm, quiet, vigilant awareness that the agitation of the mind is pacified. And so that doesn't mean it is pleasant. It's often unpleasant, but the way these states of refined attention are often described is as the imposing of a certain level of peace and equanimity on the cognitive economy. And so the act of attending itself isn't as much something that's endured. What's endured is the suffering that the attention makes salient. Because what you want for a Buddhist soteriological perspective is not for your karmic baggage to dictate the course of your life outside the threshold of your awareness. You want to bring it into the threshold of your awareness so that you can cut through it. But it strikes me that there might be quite a bit of overlap here based on the way you were describing it. I'm remembering the way some other colleagues of mine described Vale, and I thought the overlap was less obvious. She seems to be a realist about the self, for example. But this point about letting things be, that resonates with certain forms of meditation. There are certain traditions of Buddhist philosophy that construct Vipassana meditation as a kind of like panoramic, just allowing phenomena to arise. It's not universal. There are other versions of it that are much less open. They're actually really dogmatic about what you're allowed to, what's permissible and what's not. But yeah, it seems to me that I need to read Vale and Murdoch as well. I think that was Jonathan's point as well. This is certainly a blind spot in my thinking here.
Thanks, Sean. What you say about the discontinuity of time, or the experience of the discontinuity of time in Buddhism, is of course, in the way, for a full overlap. But yeah, anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Message, I'm scrolling down to the bottom.
Yeah. And of course, if you can utter words, that's great too.
Yeah, George. Can there be conflicts between norms of attention? Can attending well with respect to certain norms in a given situation involve forms of loss and even failures with respect to other norms? Oh yeah. Yes, indeed. I think that there are lots of situations where prudential norms can be violated by moral norms. Like maybe I throw myself in front of a bus to save a child. That involves paying attention to the child's well-being at the expense of my own. Yeah, I think we're in conflict all the time over these things. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, Dr. Perkins has his hand up rather than typing the text box. So if you don't mind, Dr. Perkins.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if you were taking questions with hands up at this point. Sean, I really agree with you, and there's just complications I'm trying to sort out. And one of them is some feeling like there's still got to be some account of what accurate perception is, in spite of the fact that I agree with you that there's always this kind of bias. So I'm thinking, with the optimist pessimist kind of division, that there should be some way to account for the right amount in there, or maybe to put it more concretely, right? You were quoting, I think, Evan Thompson and somebody else on this idea of reducing biases, and it seems hard to do away with an idea that one could be more or less biased. And that being too biased in any of these ways might be wrong. So even like I could see, so I'm tempted to say we should have a slight bias towards seeing what is lovable in others. But we also need to see when they're dangerous and bad too. But we should maybe not see them accurately, but like a kind of slight bias for that. But I want to say that there's still something that's like a less biased way or a more accurate way. And maybe one way to get at it would just be to say that we need multiple biases so that they correct each other. Maybe that would be one way to account without a sense of like accurate experience. But I'm not sure. I mean, if you could say something about what you would take as, if there is something like more or less biased or more or less accurate experience.
So 3 things here. The first is that your suggestion at the end that we need multiple things, multiple biases, that's right. That's the first piece to keep in mind. I think that's correct. That's what I would say. The second thing is to note, I think, yeah, you can decrease certain affective biases, but you're going to do that by increasing others. Okay. And I just think that there are different domains. This is also, I think, piggybacking on something, my response to Taylor's really good question. I think that figuring out the answer to what it means to live a good life, you know, how to solve the problem of having the right kind of existential attention norms, how to pay attention to the world in a way where your life goes best, that's really hard. Like, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm less concerned about accurate perception, because that's a place where environmental perturbations that aren't interpersonal just give us a lot of invariant stimulus. And because our sensory systems are so similar in their construction, the intersubjective agreement that we acquire through that coordinated attention is so much that we have no reason to doubt the objectivity of what we perceive, even if our analysis of that objectivity is something like Husserlian intersubjectivity. Okay, so there are just different domains where this problem is less intense. For me, interpersonally and existentially, it's just a quagmire. It's just a total nightmare. And that's why I'm trying to think about it, because I want my life to go better. But I'm not here worried about perception. Like I'm not over here having like, but is my perception vertical? I'm not stressed about it. Are my relationships wholesome? I'm stressed about it. Yeah.
So the medium between seeing things as better than they are, the optimist, and worse than they are, the pessimist, is really just a kind of intersubjectively established kind of what is normal set of biases. Would that be?
Yeah, that's one way to go. Another piece there, though, is something like I'm just thinking of. I think there's a relationship here between that narrative and a kind of Nietzschean narrative, because Nietzsche's about this, right? Like Nietzsche talks a lot about overlapping affects and how they kind of shape our sense of what's objective. But he's also deeply concerned with human nature, right? He thinks there are facts about what makes us healthy. He's not great about telling us what they are. He's just like, breathe the free air on the mountainside is like, like you get those sorts of images. But I think he's trying to like clear away certain things to drill down into something less fettered, less agitated, less hemmed in. And I'm not trying to buy that wholesale, but I think there's room in what I'm saying to start pointing towards something like live a healthy life. Like that there are facts of the matter about what that is, and they have to do with getting your affects in order and recognizing the depth and pervasiveness of your predicament and taking it seriously and not just reacting to all your feelings all the time. That was a little hand wavy, so I apologize if I wasn't being as precise as would be ideal. No.
Dr. Jackson and Odin have questions. They're raising their hands, but they might want to use their computers.
I'm just looking at the people who are here. Oh, no, Masato's still here. Okay, good. Yeah. So was Steve? I think I saw Steve with his hand up a while ago, so we should let him get in here. And then after that, Dr. J. And also, please feel free to just like go when you need to go. It's like we've been here a while. I'm going to stay until there's no more questions, but if people need to go, like have a great weekend and thanks for hanging out.
Hi, Sean.
Steve.
Thank you for your talk.
My pleasure.
there's so many schools in Buddhism. I'm going to ask you my question from the standpoint of Yogacara Buddhism, which I know we're both interested in. And Yogacara related texts like Lankavatara Sutra or The Awakening of Faith in Mahayana.
Sure.
As you know well, they analyze mind into 8 layers.
Yep.
There's like 8 noetic functions which constitute the noetic world we see. And this 8th layer in particular, they call the Alaya Vijnana, the storehouse consciousness or warehouse consciousness. Perhaps in the early Buddhist Pali text, they call that the Bhavanga Chitta. According to Yogacara psychology, in this deep base consciousness, the Alaya Vijnana, it's the world we see, this Maya-like illusion, is constructed by all these interpretations. Not only interpretations from our life, but since beginningless time, these interpretations have been accumulated over innumerable transmigrations, right?
Sure.
So it's like an ancient stream of memory with preconceptions and inclinations, habitual predispositions and tendencies, which lead to obsessions and compulsions, addictions, affective biases, and their affective saliences, what in Husserlian phenomenology they might call sedimentations.
Yeah, good.
But in Yogacara Buddhism, through yogic contemplation, you can achieve what they call this event of paravritti, revolution of the basis.
Yeah.
And this is when you totally cleanse the Alaya Vijnana of all of its habitual predispositions, and you achieve what they call, it's a Sanskrit word, Ardashana Jnana, the great mirror wisdom. It's basically the Dharmakaya of luminous emptiness. So do you believe that this is such an event possible? This revolution of the basis, achievement of great mirror wisdom, Dharmakaya, luminous emptiness and suchness? Or is this just a myth and we're always going to be confined to our, that it's impossible to eliminate our affective biases through attentional re-education?
Wow. I mean, put me on the spot here, Steve.
Well, it's a huge question, right?
Yeah. Is enlightenment possible? I mean, I don't know if I'm qualified to answer the question.
That's my question, right?
Yeah. Well, I want to drive to the heart of your question, but I want to do so in stages. Okay, so the first thing I want to note is that Yogacara philosophers are non-dualist. So their conception of the problem of suffering and its cessation as Buddhist philosophers is that there's not just an overlay. It's not just that we're biased, though we are that. It's that there is a subject-object duality. There is a grasper-grasped dichotomy, and that dichotomy itself is fundamentally wrong. And so their way of articulating the solution is this non-dual, luminous, selfless consciousness that is purified of all these defilements. My response to that potential, or that sort of, look, this is possible, will be something like, I hope so. That sounds really nice. It seems very far away from where I am. So it's hard for me to imagine being a fairly agitated person. That being said, what it would mean to achieve that, right? I'm not so much of a skeptic that I look at, thousands of years of contemplative practice across many traditions, Buddhist, non-Buddhist, Indian, non-Indian, Christian, Muslim, all the world's great religious and philosophical traditions, advert to certain forms of experience which are transformative. I've had some of those experiences myself. They're real enough. Where I get skeptical is when these experiences are described in a way where the subject is perfect, where the mind is completely cleansed of all disposition and bias. I don't think that's possible. I think that you can have certain kinds of biases that are so fantastic, maybe, that you can live with them in maximal harmony with others, right? Like the Buddha was blissed out on compassion. That's a bias for me, right? Metta, loving kindness, is a bias because it selectively ignores. When you generate metta for somebody, you're focusing on what's lovable in them, not what's idiotic. You're making a choice about what to prioritize. So even the mind that is free from whatever kleshas that keep it embedded in samsara, just taking on the Buddhist soteriology and cosmology for a moment, for the sake of argument. Even in the moment of emancipation and the subsequent, life that's lived post-emancipation, there are these pro-social attitudes that are very important for skillful conduct and teaching. And for me, this is why I focused on them in my talk, these Brahma Viharas. They're biases, right? They are biases. They are absolutely filters that we use to intelligently ignore huge swaths of information. So I am not a skeptic about the possibilities of spiritual emancipation. I am myself a disciple of this possibility, and I work hard for it, even though it seems like it's very far away. But my conceptualization of it is I don't tend to go in for non-dualist models for various reasons I can unpack for you. And I think that even in the descriptions we have of what skillful conduct looks like post-enlightenment, we see the work of bias there as a necessary filter for skillful pedagogy.
Okay, thank you, Sean. I'm just worried that if you're correct, that it renders salvation, it renders moksha, liberation from karmically inherited predispositions, impossible.
I don't think it's impossible. I just think that what it amounts to is having the right kinds of filters. And then when you die, we're assuming again for the moment, like it really depends on what we mean by liberation in this context, right? Because is it liberation from certain forms of life that cause suffering, or is it liberation from the cycle of rebirth? Because if you're a realist about rebirth, then liberation in its final moment is paranirvana for the Buddhists, like it's liberation without remainder. The aggregates are extinct. That's a very, I have no opinion about that. That's a massive level of metaphysical commitment. I don't know about that, but if we keep it bounded within this life, and we're just talking about freedom from dukkha, where we keep dukkha just as lamentation, grief, despair, the misery of knowing you're going to die, I don't see why we can't achieve emancipation from those kinds of filters by taking on other filters. Just change the glasses. You're always going to wear glasses. The sun is too bright. You need glasses. Right? Just put on the right pair. That's the way I think about it. It's like instead of being hateful and indifferent and jealous and indifferent, I'm going to be a pious Buddhist for a moment. I'm going to be loving, sympathetic, compassionate, and equanimous.
Well, the Yogacara position, in the Yogacara position, you take the glasses off once and for all. The storehouse is a storehouse of what? Of karma, of vasanas or habit energies, of samskaras, mental impressions, or anusayas, right? These sleeping dispositions. Yeah. And in Yogacara, it is possible to once and for all cleanse your storehouse and to attain this dharmakaya perception of luminous emptiness, suchness.
Yeah, you're right. I agree. That's an accurate representation of their view. I've tried to give you a little pushback from a quasi-Buddhist perspective for why I'm like, that objectivism is what I'm kind of like, no, I don't know. Yeah,
I don't know.
thank
It's
you.
an endless, this is an ultimate debate, I think, that is difficult to resolve once and for all. But thank you for your.
Thanks for bringing it up. I
yeah.
appreciate it. Now I know
Dr.
Ian
J.
has a bunch of questions. Does anyone else
Dr.
have any questions?
Dr. J, did you have a question?
Dr. J, thank you.
Oh, please unmute yourself.
First, along with many others, thank you very much for this talk. I think it really generates some really important kinds of things to think about. Numbers of things, though, that in a way, what Steve just brought up, and that is if you get into the, you often use the word Buddhists, and I know you know that it's much more complex than that. There are lots of different schools and takes and so on and so on. But one of the things that I think I'm experiencing a bit of dismissiveness about from you is that, and I don't mean it in a flip way, that folks who engage in this process, and I don't mean that as a singular thing, because there's the Theravada approach too. If you look at what happens in Tibet, and when the Dalai Lama talks about what is his meditation like, and he talks about analytic meditation, and so it involves different cognitive sorts of things that are happening. I think that in the contemporary world, there are many people now, and including practitioners, first of all, who will say, if you're thinking of a serious commitment to meditation, your first question should be, who's the teacher?
Yeah.
And of course, right?
Yeah.
So people who go out and they have a bad experience with it, and there's ample data for that. So there are various people who just in a way shouldn't be in the practice. Now, what I want to bring up is a particular psychiatrist therapist by the name of Mark Epstein.
Sure.
Okay, and you've read his stuff maybe.
Yeah, it's been a while, but I know who he is. Thoughts Without a Thinker.
Yes, Thoughts Without a Thinker and so on. And you've heard, I'm sure, of Jack Kornfeld, Joseph Goldstein.
Yeah.
You know, people, I think.
Buddhist modernists.
Pardon?
Yeah, go ahead. I have lots of views about these people. Go ahead.
Well, I'm sure you do. And all I'm bringing up is, here are people who in one respect, I would say, did a form of field work.
Sure.
Not as a graduate class, but they went out to Burma and they did the hard stuff. Now, I'm not saying that this is the path. Okay, I think the Buddha is a very good example of somebody who really was very empiricist in his approach. If the narratives are to be accepted, he went to virtually all the teachers and tried all the techniques and said, these don't work. These don't work. And finally, he had an experience. And then he, as we all know, he came back to do the teaching. But another thing that he said, I think that's really important, that I think you would agree with, he said, don't take my word for it. So if you're just reading someone's account, I don't care what his name is. Basically, you do the work. And if you don't believe it, do the work and I'm sure you know this as well, do the work doesn't just mean reading the text and memorizing and so on. And so I'm just thinking that, okay, I want to add the other thing that I think is important about Mark Epstein's work. And that is patients who come to him with a very serious behavioral difficulty. They're functioning well in society, but they have a repetitive pattern of a sort that gets in their way. And when they go to him, what he finds is, as they begin the reflective process, they get to a certain point where they're just overcome by the terror of it. Now, my languaging for that is their attention is hijacked. They haven't willed that. That's a form of affective bias. Now there's something that's pulling them back from that. And that's a dynamic that he finds that what's helpful to them is a form of mindfulness. I think that's a word that's become mainly useless because of the way it's thrown around. Okay, but what that enables a person to do is to get sufficient control when the hijacking starts. And there's this tsunami of feeling that's arising, that's overcoming them, where they've always retreated in terror before and won't go near it. They finally have got an ability to, satipatthana, to be in the body, okay, to reclaim the hijacked attention, observe, and if you want to say with an attentional bias, okay, to observe, I think, in a qualitatively different form of observation, the rising and the roar of this blackness through this, whatever, the psyche, and then it's gone, and now they have a different quality of clarity. And so he sees that there are very powerful things that some folks need. I think with you, for instance, and I've been in that place, there's something I really ought to do, but I don't do it. And I think, what is it that I can't, we have this word in the English nomenclature of willpower. Maybe it's a function of willpower, okay? But I think we get caught in a place where there's another Lama, a Tibetan Yeshe, and he's got a book called How to Be or Becoming Your Own Therapist. And he gives a talk to a group of therapists. And they ask him, what would you do about da-da-da-da? And he said, well, one of the things that I think is important to clarify, and he's making a rather blanket, and I don't want to put it that way. His response is, you folks talk about a mental problem. We don't use that framework of having a mental problem. We say you have a mind problem. And the mind problem is a very different understanding of the nature of mind. And as Steve was saying before, how many levels are there of mind? And if that's in fact the case, that the nomenclature and the understanding of mind has this kind of complexity in it, then maybe I think one of the problems I have then is I haven't gotten to a point yet where I'm able to understand or absorb that nomenclature into this whatever that's going on in my mind. So, in the meditation that they're doing in the experiments with the Dalai Lama and the meditators, is they've used the expression, what the meditation does is it lengthens the distance between the spark and the flame. And so there's a place where you can learn through this discipline to not allow your attention to be hijacked. So I'm sorry to go on for so long, but I'm just thinking that those are things that complex. Well, I don't even want to say that. So that I'm done. That's what I'm thinking of, that there are important intersections, let me put it that way, that your claim that in the end, I think that I find most dismaying in a way is that there's no way of overcoming this bias. That's a given. That's a given. Now, I don't think you mean to say that's also a victim to, or that's also subject to my analysis. That's a particular bias I have. So anyway, I'm done.
Okay. So,
and again, thanks for the talk, by the way, because it really
okay.
what
So
you
a lot
want
of
to do.
moving parts here, and I'm gonna address as many of them as I can. Okay. So the first one.
Sean.
Oh, no, you don't. We can talk later because I wanted, yeah. Let
What's up?
Masato come in and do it.
Sean. Briefly, please. Briefly. You don't have to offer a thorough account of this very big topic now, but briefly. That's all I wanted to say. Okay.
Thought you'd know me well enough by now, Sato. Okay. So a lot of things here. So the first thing is I don't think I'm being dismissive. I think I'm reconstructing moral psychology in a specific way relative to certain independent constraints that I've given philosophical arguments for. Regarding the Buddha as an empiricist, I think this is something that Buddhist scholars would call a modernist conceit. And the reason they call it a modernist conceit is that it represents a certain image of the Buddha as a kind of scientist who's exploring the mind. And that's maybe partially true. And you're right, there is a discourse in the Pali Canon where the Buddha says, don't believe it because I told you. He also says, don't believe it because of logic or inference. Right? He dismisses a lot of things that we might think are really helpful. He says, only if you experience it for yourself. And it's worth noting that the Buddha is making these claims in the context of being asked by the people in this particular village who they should listen to. They're like, look, you come through here with your monks and you tell us how to live. And then the next week it's the Brahmins. And then the week after that, it's the Jains. And then the week after that, it's the Ajivikas. And you're all telling us different stuff. How are we supposed to know what to do? And he's like, good question. That's hard, right? And in that context, he says, practice it for yourself and see if it works. And if it does, then practice it. That's fine. But for every remark, for every place in a Buddhist literature where you see the Buddha playing the role of an empiricist, I'll show you another place where he's an epistemic dictator, right? Where he says, there's this world and there's the next world. Why? Because I say so. It's not simple.
Right.
The Buddha's religious authority is a complex matter, as is the claims of his omniscience. And those claims must be situated in a context around him. The first person the Buddha spoke to after he was enlightened was a naked Ajivaka who thought he was crazy. The Buddha's like, I am the all-conquering one. I have fully penetrated the veil of samsara. And the dude's like, yeah, okay, whatever, buddy, and walks away. So the Buddha as an empiricist is a particular image that the modern scientific mind, which has become, I think, obsessed with Buddhist meditation practices for interesting socio-historical reasons, we project that image back onto the Buddha because it suits the narrative we're trying to construct now, which is the whole point I'm making in my talk. That this is the feedback loop that we live in, right? Most of those Buddhist authors that you cited, people like Epstein, Cornfield, Kabat-Zinn, these psychologists who went to India and had a really fun time in the 70s and came back here and did some research and started meditation centers and made a lot of money. A lot of money. I'm not denigrating their work. I'm saying that it is a particular brand that is, and that we are living with their interpretation of Buddhism, and that their interpretation of it is a very historically specific one that has been absorbed into the culture, and then we imbibe that interpretation, and then we think we've figured out what the essential dharma is. The Buddha was just a scientist exploring the nature of mind, just like modern psychology. Let's focus on that. You know, that's a constructed image as much as anything is. The Dalai Lama is very interested in talking to neuroscientists. He also takes advice from demons in other dimensions. He has monks whose specific job it is to go into trances and have conversations with other invisible beings, which he listens to, right? So of course he's interested in Buddhism since the 19th century has been powerfully interested in authenticating itself through the rhetoric of science. And it's been done in Tibet, it's been done in Sri Lanka, it's been done in Burma. And the main purpose was to resist Christian colonialism. And that doesn't mean that what they're saying is wrong. We inherit that image of the Buddhist teachings and we work with it as best we can. My point is recognize it for what it is. It's a historically contingent image of the Buddhist teaching that we use as a filter to interpret a complex history in ways that are relevant to our goals and explanatory needs and practices and projects. Right? And so I'm not being dismissive, I'm critical.
Good, that's a good, no problem with that at all.
Yeah.
So,
of course.
All right. So I mean,
Calling
I
it
mean, I'm interested in Buddhism too. So let me make a brief remark
Please.
in relation to what Dr. J was saying. So I really appreciate your talk, and I want to learn more about what the Pali text informs us about, the earlier phases of Buddhism. On the other hand, as you're well aware of, we have East Asian Buddhism quite prominent in our department, and most notably in Tiantai Buddhism, we have this very broad debate regarding the 5 times and the 8 teachings of Buddha. So basically, after enlightenment, I mean, there are all sorts of invented sutras that describe different stages of Buddhist teachings and the style, so on and so forth, with which he, taught his followers for many years. So the basic debate is which sutra, for example, best represents his teaching. And of course, in the Tiantai Buddhism, especially in the Japanese version, the Lotus Sutra is considered the highest.
Yeah.
And then that lays the foundation for like East Asian Buddhism in some sense, and influences Zen Buddhism, according to which one naive question is like, after you get approved by your Zen master, what happens? I mean, are you done, right? The answer is you're not done. And one theoretical justification is that you go back to this Tiantai idea. So once you hit enlightenment, it's not that you are done, you have your Dharmakaya and you invisible something, you continue to train. Like there's a post-enlightenment practice thing. And I'm just calling your attention to the other sphere of Buddhism in East Asia, because like Tibetan Buddhism is of course like largely Mahayana, but the other side of Buddhism that we study a lot in our department has a different kind of a set of, I think, views that would try to make sense of the process, the processual nature of enlightenment. So it's basically, the question is it an instant? If you attain nirvana, are you done? And probably you're not. So there's a long debate going on the Tiantai tradition, which I just wanted to insert here because it seems like, one piece that addresses the very question. And I fully go with my own biases. I've never been free of any biases, but I think in the end, in Tiantai Buddhism, you acknowledge that, and still they retain. They think that enlightenment is something very real. So it's not just biases, yeah, right. So stage theory. I think what I'm saying is that there's this long debate regarding stages, and I think some of the comments coming from Dr. J and Steve actually arise in that context. So, Sean, I look forward to more about this. And I'm really missing that part of Buddhism that you have expertise in. And I usually don't appeal to authority, but as the coordinator of this afternoon talk, number one, thank you so very much. This was fun, great talk. Number two, I think we can, give you and ourselves a bit of rest if people don't mind. If you want to continue, I can make you host or co-host anytime.
I think I'm already co-host, so.
Okay, are you already co-host? All right. Other people, thank you for joining us. I really think that, talking about doing philosophy in person in this way is very rewarding. We're missing that altogether.
Indeed.
But it is 5 p.m. So if you think that, okay, we are one step closer to enlightenment, but we are not done yet, that's fine. Okay, we continue. And if you really want to attain enlightenment today before like 6 p.m., stay in this room. All right.
Thanks, Masato. I will stay as long as anyone has questions, but I am also quite tired and happy to call it a day if people are punch themselves out. Totally your call. There's a small enough number of people in this room right now that people could just be like, we're good.
Yes.
Does anyone have any more questions?
I'm just here for the show.
I
Oh,
might,
sure.
I might have like one more question.
Stretch
but-
yourself. It's totally
But
okay.
Taylor has a question too, maybe. I have a question on like the scope of the kinds of perceptions that you're talking about, whether it like goes all the way to like pervasive, like cognitions of any kind whatsoever. So you're saying that all our cognitions are biased. So like, I don't know, I'm thinking of like maybe like a rationalist or something like that, who thinks that you have like, you can like perceive the thing rationally or whatever. Is even that sort of like effectively biased for you as well?
That's a great question. I mean, like, I don't think that my knowledge that 7 and 5 are 12 is effectively biased in any problematic way, right? The way I would address these sorts of concerns is just to say, psychologically, what it is to get something in view of the mind involves affects being stimulated in the system, but the content of certain kinds of representations, especially abstract mathematical ones, and certain invariant patterns of behavior in the naturals that we unearth through doing natural science. I don't think that we have good reason to think of those kinds of representations as possessing an inherently problematic level of bias towards which we should exercise any self-awareness. Like I am more or less a realist about empirical science, as much as, and I don't have a considered view about what mathematical objects are. I'm not sure where I fall on that, but epistemically speaking, these things are not keeping me up at night. And the reason they're not keeping me up at night is because the role that affects play in making the contents of those representations salient is not pernicious, because we have other relevant constraints like the environment and each other, which more or less eliminate affects from relevant consideration in evaluating certain types of representations.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. I'm wondering if you think it's possible for one to have a certain kind of bias that one would not be able to escape from and not be able to like cognitively recognize one had such a bias. Yeah.
You don't know what you don't know.
Yeah, that's sort of what I'm
I'm open to it.
Okay, that's fine.
But you
Taylor
don't
had
know what you don't know. Do you see my point?
Yeah.
If I said yes, I've already kind of made it something I know about.
Okay, fair enough.
All right, Taylor, you get the last word.
I had a question too, but I can email.
Oh, Rule, yeah, go ahead. I mean, look, Masato, you have a family. Like, by all means, like, do not feel the need to like persist. But like, I'll stick it out. I got nothing to do tonight except write.
Rule, just
go ahead.
Ask it now.
Yeah, it's all you, Rule.
I was just gonna ask about something you brought up with William. Actually, I think this is an important part of it. Is a question about how are you getting in the habit in relation to attention? How are you conceiving of the kind of structure of getting into these habits? Like, what's the philosophy of habit here? Because it seems like you kind of need that for your attention. And because I basically agreed with most of everything you've said. So, but I think this kind of, you need functionally kind of need this to get this.
Yeah, I just don't know if I have the expertise to be prescriptive in that way. Like, I think there are different roads here. There are different ways to, this is a bit of a throwaway, but it's easier to, you have a bad habit you're trying to break, and you try to break the habit, you'll fail. If you cultivate a positive habit whose effects counteract the effects of the habit you're trying to break, you'll have a lot more success. So, you know, one thing I would recommend is habit formation, like positive behavioral repertoires, the cultivation of those in various ways, whether it's learning a new skill, doing something physical that gets you in touch with your body. Doing things like that with intent is really important for health. And so I think, I don't know if there's a domain general answer to your question, because the kinds of problems that I'm articulating are very specific and person-centered. So, you know, you'd have to talk to me a little, you know?
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, maybe this is slightly off. It just had brought up, I was thinking if there's an early 19th century French philosopher, Ravissant, and he's got this kind of idea of habit, where it moves. It's basically like it's starting off with a loaded amount of consciousness and less unconsciousness, and you're moving more into like when you are able to form after repetition a more unconscious kind of association with something.
William James talks like this in the Principles of Psychology as well.
Yeah. William James read Ravissant. He was really influenced by him. So I was curious, kind of like, because I know that you're interested in Husserl and William James, so that's kind of why I was going in there.
Yeah, I mean, repetition is key. You know, fluidity is key. Training spontaneous response, that's a big part of it. You know, and the journey from kind of vigilance to effortless skill is sort of the road I'm trying to articulate here. Really hard. You know, I keep reading all these Taoist texts and I'm like, all this non-active, like skillful, completely non-intentional accomplishments sound really great. It's completely foreign to me. You know, like everything in my life is willful effort. Like that's how I'm just like, I just like get things done. Like it's like there's a list and I cross things off of it. I don't want to live this way, but like I envision a better world. I'm just not sure how to get there. Laying bricks, you know.
Sean, I think that question itself is then very general regarding habit, because habit is just like karmic conditioning.
Yeah, that's
so right. Your recommendation sounds like replace bad karmic conditioning with better karmic conditioning.
Yeah.
But of course, overcoming karma is the ultimate goal.
That's right.
So the problem is a very general one, and I think your position makes sense. I mean, as long as we live in this world, we are like habit-taking creatures. And even if we replace half of our bad habits with better ones, I mean, it's not that we are habit-free or anything. And according to your reading, a habit is a necessary filtering system in order to even have our own perspectives. So I think there's some generality to the rules question. And that means we are opening a new bag of more problems. And habit is an important concept in William James, of course, as you already know, and it is in John Dewey too. I think there's a lot in John Dewey habit. So thank you very much again, and you have an existential choice to make. Right? You referring to everyone, okay? You can wait for a showdown or I don't know, a new stage unfolding or whatever. But it is past 5, and you have your things to finish, I suppose. Supper to take, etc. So I'm just overseeing everyone, and if you're fine, we can call this great afternoon to an end. How's that?
I'm okay with that.
Is everyone okay?
Thank you, Sean.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a good weekend.
Too.
See ya.
Bye.